Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are getting into a really fascinating piece that connects a 1950s fashion column to, of all things, modern-day politics, cocktails, and the very idea of resistance. Everything really kicks off with this line from the writer Sherry Sklar. It's so powerful, right? An ode to resistance wrapped in brocade, bourbon, and a well-cut line. It just perfectly sets the stage for what we're talking about, this idea that resistance isn't always shouting. Sometimes it's kind of quiet, woven right into the fabric of our lives. And that brings us to the big question for this whole explainer. Seriously, how can a fashion column, from 1958 no less, give us a way to understand our own, let's be honest, pretty complicated and chaotic world today? Well, let's dive in and find out. So here's our game plan. We're going to start with this concept of resistance in brocade. Then we'll meet the woman behind it, Barbara Blake. After that, we'll explore her revolt in a hemline, and then see how our source ties that story to modern politics, to fashion with a purpose, and we'll end with a final thought on courage. Okay, so our story begins with the author of our source material, Sherry Sklar. And the way she tells it, during a pretty turbulent time, she's just flipping through her vintage playbill collection, and she stumbles on this clue, this little echo from the past. And that clue? It was Nellie Forbush, the cockeyed optimist from South Pacific. For the author, Nellie is this symbol of almost naive, relentless hope. And finding her in an old playbill felt both really ironic and also kind of perfect for a world that just felt completely upside down.
Now, Nellie's story was inside a playbill from 1958. And that leads us to the woman who wrote its fashion column, who's really the historical heart of this whole thing. So, who was Barbara Blake?
Well, she was so much more than just a style writer. Barbara Blake was the fashion editor for Playbill for a long, long time. And get this, for years, she was the only top-ranking woman at the entire company. She often wrote under different names, which, was a pretty common thing for professional women back then. And she had this incredible skill for mixing high-end fashion with stuff that real people could actually wear. The bottom line is, she wasn't just following trends, she was a huge cultural voice, really shaping American taste after the war. Now, to really get what Blake was doing, you got to picture her world. We're talking 1950s America. The source paints this picture of, peak conservatism, peak prosperity. Think giant Cadillacs with fins, cocktail parties, perfect little suburban houses. In a world that's so buttoned up, even what you chose to wear could be a really big deal. And this is where you really see Blake's sharp wit and her rebellious streak come out. The big trend at the time was the chemise dress. Basically this shapeless, sack-like thing. And she didn't just critique it, she dismissed it with this amazing line. Don't look, and it will go away. I mean, that's not just fashion advice. That's a call to trust your own gut.
So here's the showdown, basically. On one side, you have the chemise, shapeless, popular. On the other, you have Barbara Blake's revolt, nipped waistlines, longer skirts. And for her, this was about way more than just a silhouette. It was a kind of declaration of independence from the fashion rules coming out of Paris. She was basically saying American women could think for themselves.
So, okay, a fashion dispute from the 1950s. How on earth does that connect to the politics of right now? Well, this is where the source's author, Sherry Sklar, uses Blake's quiet defiance as this really powerful metaphor for what's happening in our own time.
The source points to a specific series of recent events that it says created this feeling of political whiplash. It notes that Project 2025 was raising alarms, and there were controversial remarks from a VP nominee. Then you have these national shocks, a really contentious debate, and a horrifying assassination attempt. That was followed by the sitting president stepping down, which led to what the source calls the meteoric rise of VP Harris's campaign, which got a boost from a major pop culture endorsement. It's this exact sequence of events that the author uses as the backdrop for her whole argument.
So, looking at this political climate, the author reaches all the way back to 1958 and quotes Barbara Blake's own words. It would seem we all need a little touch of revolt. By using that exact phrase, she's suggesting that the very same spirit of independent defiance is what's needed now.
So, what does this modern-day revolt actually look like? Well, according to the source, it's not necessarily about marching in the streets. It's about looking inside your own closet. It's a revolt that's all about purpose-driven fashion and just making more conscious choices.
Sklar even proposes this palette with purpose. Each one of these colors is picked because it has a deeper meaning. You've got cherry lacquer to feel grounded and secure, celestial yellow for a kind of cosmic escape, retro blue is soft, nostalgic, neon flare is all about action and moving forward, while future desk is more quiet and introspective. The whole idea is to use color to actually say something, to express a mood or an intention.
And then this idea of revolt becomes really practical, really down to earth. The author basically argues that the most radical thing you can do might just be resourcefulness. Rediscover what you already own, swap clothes with your friends, go thrift shopping, use resale apps. In this way of thinking, just consuming consciously becomes its own form of quiet rebellion.
But the story doesn't quite end there on that upbeat, action-focused note. The source has this really crucial postscript. It was written 100 days after the main article, and it adds this much darker, more thoughtful layer to the whole piece. And the postscript reveals this huge shift in mood. The first part of the piece was written when, as the author says, the vibe was ebullient and electric with hope. But just 100 days later, she describes things spiraling into something much darker, something defined by cultural volatility and what she calls a renewed appetite for silencing dissent. But even in that more sobering reality, the central message, it still rings true. The author concludes, rebellion does not always announce itself with megaphones or manifestos. Sometimes you find it in the small things, the persistent things, in a well-cut dress, the comfort of a pet, or just a simple, firm refusal to look away. And so we're left with this question for you to think about. From a 1950s hemline all the way to today's headlines, this idea of a quiet revolt keeps popping up. It really makes you wonder, right? In a world that is so full of noise, what does your own quiet personal revolt actually look like?